Absolutely right. And there was a pivot in 1969 for sure. Okay, let's turn to another issue that weighs heavily on Canadians and on me. The two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who have been incarcerated in China for 2.5 years. You'll be seeing President Joe Biden when you fly to the G7 summit next week in the UK. You've already asked him to do more, and he's talked about it, but nothing changes. So if our current strategy isn't working, how long can we wait?
First of all, the approach on consular cases like this one, unfortunately, takes quite a long time, and we don't always get to talk about what is going on. Much of this is wrapped up in global diplomacy, quiet pressures. I mean, if you take a situation where someone is unjustly incarcerated by, say, a random Middle Eastern or African country. If I go out and shout to the rooftops, "You got to send that person home today," and then go and yell and insult the person, it's actually going to make it harder for them to be able to send them home. Whereas if quietly we make known by the back channels this person should really come home, and when you send them home, we won't gloat, we won't say, "You see, they have a total Mickey Mouse system of justice." It actually is, it's working. We get them home quietly, and we don't get any big win. We don't get any big headlines. We get a Canadian home. That's something we've actually done a whole bunch over the past 4 or 5 years. We've had a number of very strong successes in consular cases. Now, you're absolutely right that right now the situation seems very, very locked in. And the Chinese government has been very, very strong on its pushback against every time that we point out that these two Canadians have been arbitrarily detained. One of the things we did is gathered like-minded and fellow traveler countries from around the world and move forward on a motion or an agreement on arbitrary detentions. It didn't explicitly mention China, but obviously was directed at China, saying you can't just arrest people for your own political reasons to put pressure on people back home. Because quite frankly, if we were to cave to that pressure, if a Chinese government or any government were to learn that all you have to do is arrest a Canadian tourist or a Canadian business person and we'll get what we want out of that country, then everyone becomes more at risk. So we continue to work very hard. Yes, with the Americans. Yes, with the international community. Yes, I'll be talking about it at the G7 as well. It's how we can stand up together, because it's not just Canada that's worried about this. It's Australia, it's Great Britain, it's any country around the world, it's France that might have a business person in China, so every country around the world, who would be worried that they might be next for this kind of arbitrary detention. So there's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of pressure, and we are working very, very hard on this.
Fair enough. What's the price of quiet, though? You've talked about genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada, but I haven't heard you use that phrase for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang Autonomous Region in China. Bob Ray, your ambassador to the UN, was our guest earlier in an earlier democracy forum, and he talked about being pilloried by the Chinese even for raising the question. What's holding you back on that?
Well, I think first of all, determinations of genocide are not things to be taken lightly, and that we just understand. You can't, if you start tossing the word around anytime there's a human rights violations, however real they are, it ends up, first of all, devaluing the genocides that already happened, and renders it a term that doesn't have the kind of weight that it absolutely should have. So there are international processes ongoing that are looking at the very serious human rights abuses that we know are happening in Xinjiang and making determinations about whether or not it is a genocide. Now, the Canadian Parliament made a determination based on things that they saw that it was a genocide. That is different than the Canadian government officially making a statement around that, and we made that nuance. But it is absolutely clear that the pressure on China right now from the international community, from countries like Canada, is significantly acute, particularly with the Olympics, Winter Olympics coming up in China next year, that there is a moment where the global community can be really pushing back on China, and that's something that we want to do. But I think everyone understands that it'll be easy for China, the scale it is, to shrug off what any one country, including just the US alone, says. But when the global community comes together, that starts to shape their own calculations. And that's certainly something that we are working on very, very effectively.
Okay. Quick reminder to the audience to send in your questions if you haven't already. One last one for me, turning to Canada and COVID. I know we'll get some COVID-19 questions from the audience, so let me just slip in one on the politics of this pandemic. In the last federal election, you ran hard against Premier Doug Ford. You'd mentioned him more than a dozen times a day on the campaign trail. He wasn't your opponent, but I think it's in boxing, you would call him your punching bag. And then you made peace in the pandemic, and he praised you when he came to our Democracy Forum last fall about federal provincial cooperation and concord. I think voters like seeing their governments getting along, but now he's attacking you every day about borders and border controls, airport quarantines, and for taking so long. My question is, in the next federal election, which I'm sure you're going to tell us the timing of today, how are you going to treat Doug Ford? Are you going to point to the cooperation, or is it going to be confrontation? Give us a preview.
Well, I think, first of all, a couple of things, Martin. I mean, he's in a tough situation right now. Ontario has really struggled with this pandemic from a political level. I mean, Ontarians have stepped up. Our health service providers have been unbelievable. Our frontline workers have been heroes. But the Ontario government's been, somewhat uneven in its responses, and you've written much more about it than I need to say about it. So I'll leave that there. My approach from the beginning has been, as Doug highlighted when he came to speak with you in Ryerson, to be collaborative. My job is not to judge and say this province done well, this province not. My job is to be there to support with whatever they need. And yes, I know that the pressure is mounting on Premier Ford, and it is always an easy thing to try and deflect and point fingers. And I'm going to trust that Canadians and Ontarians are going to see that for what it is. I'm not going to pick a fight with him at this point. I don't think anyone wants to see people fighting during COVID. They want to see us focused on getting through it. But I will point out that we did shut down the borders. We shut them down over a year ago to everyone but Canadians coming home and a small category of essential workers. We brought in extremely strong measures that limited importation to a very, very serious level. And a few weeks ago, in sitting down at a First Minister's meeting, Doug said to me, you've got to reduce the number of people coming into Ontario. I said, okay. 30,000 plus international students, including, I'm sure, a whole bunch of people watching this webcast at Ryerson, have come in to Ontario over the past number of months. Now, I know this because you asked us to let them in. You said that you were confident because we set up a program where universities and colleges could set up a protocol and a quarantine process that would control any importation and spread. But Doug, if you want us to suspend international students, just tell me, send us an official note and we'll do that. If you want us to suspend international travelers, if you want us to do any more, we will do that. Just tell me what you want to do. And that was like 4 weeks ago that he said to me, okay, I want you to suspend international students. I said, okay, you're going to be getting calls from university students, university presidents, but okay, you tell me that, fine. I'll follow up with you tomorrow and you just send me the note. And he never did. And he never followed up with that request or any other request for us to actually reduce the numbers of people coming into Ontario. Now, remember, we have 4 international airports across the country. And they've all been accepting people. And in Quebec, in BC, and even in Alberta, where they did have a serious spike in the third wave, they weren't blaming it on international travel. Now, maybe Ontario is different, but I think there is an awful lot of politics being played there, and I think it's unfortunate. But I also know that a lot of people, particularly Ontarians who've been watching closely this premier, will be able to see through that.
Okay, let's go to audience questions and a COVID question that flows from this. How can this comes from Leandra Nowick? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Always a liability for a host. Can Canada demonstrate leadership on a global scale in the democratization of vaccines? If I can just add a little bit to that, the question is, briefly, You're a politician. Your job is to get your voters vaccinated. It's not a crass political thing. It's what you're elected to do. There's also a conflicting impulse among Canadians to share vaccines around the world. To me, that's fascinating from a democracy point of view. How do you figure out the path?
Well, first of all, you don't end COVID anywhere until you end it everywhere. So it is not just a impossible balance. It's the balance we have to establish. Now, my job is to protect Canadians' well-being and health and safety. That's what I got elected for. And that's why we have prioritized and focused on getting Canadians vaccinated as quickly, as effectively as possible. But keeping Canadians safe also means preventing new and even stranger and more deadly variants to be generated elsewhere in the world because they're not getting vaccinations. So while we are very focused on getting Canadians to safety, getting that level of herd immunity, everyone getting to double doses in Canada, we are also, as we now are really seeing vaccines rolling in and people getting them, getting into a better place, we're also looking now at what we can do for other countries around the world. Because yes, we ordered way more vaccines than we necessarily need for Canada because we didn't know which vaccines were going to land, which ones were going to be the better ones, which ones were going to be most effective or right for Canadians. So we were very careful. But part of that was funding the vaccine research with upfront payments and signing contracts early on so that small companies like Moderna that had never made a vaccine before could suddenly develop at scale vaccines that would make a huge difference. So there is no contradiction because at the same time, we also funded massively. We were one of the earlier funders of COVAX, of the ACT Accelerator. We were one of those countries that stepped up early on to make sure that there were these mechanisms internationally. And what we're going to see accelerating around the world now is increased sharing of vaccines, particularly the vaccines that have been recognized and verified by the WHO, which is, I think, the important part. All the vaccines we talk about, Moderna, Pfizer, AZ, Janssen, all the others, and why as Canadians we consider you say AZ and not AZ? I mean, I guess it's a colonization thing. But those are all properly WHO recognized, whereas the Chinese vaccines, the Russian vaccines that are out there as well, have not gone through the same level of disclosure or study, even by the WHO, let alone by Health Canada or the FDA or anything. So there's a whole bunch of reflection about making sure that we're getting strong, effective, and safe vaccines out to the world, and we'll be continuing to do that.
Okay, but you can't, some would argue it's a zero-sum game, and I'm not here to criticize you about that. I'm actually interested in exploring the dilemma that you face. It is a balancing act. We are flooding the zone in Canada. We live right next door to the United States where it sounds like everyone's vaccinated who wants to be, and we're behind. And so we're gonna get us done first, and then we'll start sharing to others because we borrowed from COVAX before we gave back. So just give us a glimpse into how give us a reality check on how you as a politician, a prime minister, how you juggle.
One of the first things you learn as a lifeguard is if you're going out to save someone who's drowning and you yourself, you get too close and they grab onto your arm and they drag you down, you can't save anyone. And I think the understanding that Canada absolutely is doing everything it can to make sure that you get vaccines out to everyone, understanding that we are going to be vaccinating Canadians, most vulnerable Canadians, and protecting everyone here as quickly as we can so that we can do even more around the world quickly, so that we're not an area that people have to worry about and we can totally focus on everyone else, is the thinking we're doing. Is it imperfect? Is it a moral dilemma? Absolutely. People will come down on different sides of it, but I was elected to keep Canadians safe, and I don't know that I could look a grieving family in the eye if I knew that I could have done more, but felt that I had to ship off vaccines more quickly to other countries. Canada's not a producer of vaccines. We lost that pharmaceutical industry a number of decades ago. If that had been different, we might have been able to have a different posture. But we were out there in the international market. We signed deals. We made investments. We were able to secure a solid sourcing for Canada. And that's what Canadians first and foremost expect of me.
I suppose it's like the airline warning, which says announcement, which says put the oxygen mask on your face first before you handle the infant. I shouldn't be giving you lines, but it does occur to me.